Hello everyone, join me today for another story. Mrs Wiggins' Wartymelons by Glenda, Millard and Stephen Axelsen. Down Korweinguboora way, almost all the folk were potato farmers, even Mrs Wiggins. Ralphie had lived with Mrs Wiggins since he was just a kid. One day, Mrs Wiggins said to Ralphie, "I am tired of growing taters, Ralphie." Ralphie was pruning rose bushes. He munched on a mouthful of tender little rosebuds and thought for a bit. Why don't you grow watermelons instead?" he asked. He was very fond of all things tropical. He'd once eaten the sleeves of a Hawaiian shirt. They tasted like fruit salad. "Oh, Ralphie, no one has ever grown watermelons in Korweinguboora before. Just think, what would people say?" "I don't know," said Ralphie. "What would they say?" "They would say that we can't grow watermelons in Korweinguboora. That's what they would say, Ralphie." But Ralphie liked the idea of watermelons. "Well, I think we should try," he said. "Who cares what people say?" So Mrs Wiggins and Ralphie got the bus to town.
"Howdy, Mrs Wiggins," said the driver. "Howdy, Ralphie. How are your potatoes growing?"
"We're not growing taters this season, Mr Kneebone," said Mrs Wiggins. Mr Kneebone's jaw dropped.
"Not potatoes?"
"That's right. Ralphie and me going to grow watermelons. We are going to town to buy seeds." The other passengers shook their heads in disbelief as Mrs Wiggins and Ralphie sat down together. Then a voice called from the back seat of the bus.
"You can't grow watermelons in Korweinguboora. The nights are too cold."
"There! What did I tell you, Ralphie?" giggled Mrs Wiggins. "But we don't care what they say, do we, Ralphie? We are going to grow them anyway." They got off the bus at the bank. Mr Morgan, the bank manager, stabbed her bank book and handed Mrs Wiggins some nice new bank notes.
"Going to do some shopping, eh, Mrs Wiggins?"
"Yes. Me and Ralphie's going into the watermelon business. We are off to buy some seeds."
"Are you sure that's wise, Mrs Wiggins? The nights can be nippy in Korweinguboora. I don't know how well watermelons will grow."
"Well then, that's three of us, Mr Morgan. Ralphie and me don't know either. We are going to try anyway," said Mrs Wiggins. Ralphie looked down his nose at Mr Morgan before he and Mrs Wiggins went off to the produce store. "A big bucket, please, Mr Cornthwaite. Ralphie and me want a whole paddock full of big, fat, shiny watermelons." Mr Cornthwaite shook his head.
You can't grow this in Korweinguboora, Mrs Wiggins. They hate cold nights. Look, it says So, right here on the bucket. No, this is potato growing country.
Then she and Ralphie got the bus home again. That evening, Ralphie looked up in the sky through his kaleidoscope. "It's going to be a very nice day tomorrow, Mrs. Wiggins," he said. "Rose petal pink, tingled with forget-me-not blue, and just a sparkling of green diamonds around the edges. Sounds like a perfect day for planting watermelons, Ralphie." Early next morning, Mrs. Wiggins and Ralphie went into the paddock. Ralphie lowered his head and ploughed beautiful straight furrows with his horns. Mrs. Wiggins followed, pressing her big black seeds into the soil. When the seeds were all planted, Mrs. Wiggins fetched her peg bag from the clothesline and emptied out all the pegs. Then she tied it under Ralphie's tail. "Now, Ralphie dear, you just fill that up. I hear there is nothing better than goat's droppings for growing watermelons." Every morning, Ralphie and Mrs. Wiggins watered and weeded and fertilized until the seeds grew into little watermelon plants. And then at last, those plants grew loads of tiny watermelons. Every evening, Ralphie and Mrs. Wiggins sat admiring their crop. Mrs. Wiggins knitted with her tortoiseshell knitting needles and bright red wool. Pearl and plain, knit one, slip one, pick one up. Ralphie kept an eye on the weather through his kaleidoscope. But though the days were fine and warm, there was a chill in the air. "How are we going to keep the watermelons warm at night?" Ralphie asked. Mrs. Wiggins just kept on knitting, with a secret little smile on her lips. "Now, don't you worry about that, Ralphie." When the watermelons were the size of footballs, Mrs. Wiggins stopped knitting and showed Ralphie what she had made. Hundreds and hundreds of little red jackets. "To stop them watermelons getting cold at night," she explained. She and Ralphie buttoned all those plump little watermelons into their jackets. They snuggled up as warm as toast with Ralphie's droppings all around them. And how they grew! Then one night, Ralphie was woken by a dreadful noise on the tin roof. It sounded like hailstones. The crop would be ruined. He woke Mrs. Wiggins and they rushed outside. There, in the moonlight, they saw hundreds of red buttons bouncing and rolling all over the roof. "Oh, Ralphie, those watermelons have grown so big and fat. The buttons have popped right off the jackets," laughed Mrs. Wiggins. "It's time for the harvest. We've done it, Ralphie. We've showed those farmers it can be done." And indeed they had. But that was many years ago. Mrs. Wiggins and Ralphie have retired now. They still sit on a veranda on balmy summer evenings. Ralphie keeps an eye on the weather and Mrs. Wiggins knits little woolen jackets. She knits them for the farmers in Korweinguboora, who now grow watermelons instead of potatoes. Did you know that Korweinguboora is a real town in Victoria in Australia? Mrs Wiggins' watermelon story is for the people of Korweinguboora. And for you, for me, and all those who believe they can.